The man carried the clock in both hands, the way you carry something that belongs to someone who is no longer there to carry it themselves. It was wrapped in a canvas cloth, the kind used for drop cloths, not for transporting antiques, and it was heavy enough that the effort showed in the set of his shoulders as he came through the front door of Callaway and Stern Fine Timepieces. The receptionist looked up. A man in his mid-40s, work jacket, boots with dried mud on the left heel, a 6-year-old girl on his right side gripping 2 fingers of his free hand. The clock, from what showed at the edges of the canvas, appeared to be old, very old, and not in the way that things in a shop like this are old, in the way that something is old when it has been lived alongside for generations. The man at the front desk, whose name was Brent, said what he said before the door had fully closed behind them. He said it to the colleague nearest him, a comment about the canvas, about the boots, about the particular combination of the two in a shop whose insurance policy alone cost more per month than most people's rent. He said it with the ease of someone who has made the same observation so many times it no longer registers as cruelty. His colleague smiled. The girl, whose name was June, looked up at the sound. She did not fully understand what had been said, but she understood the sound of it. Children always do. 20 minutes later, the most respected horological appraiser in the northeastern United States was crouching in the middle of that same shop floor, her reading glasses pushed up into her hair, both hands resting on her knees, looking at the movement of that clock with an expression that Brent had never seen on her face in 11 years of working in the same building. She had not touched it yet. She was simply looking. Her lips were pressed together in the particular way of a person who is trying not to say something before they are certain. Then she was certain, and what she said quietly, almost to herself, was that it was not possible. And then she looked up and asked who had made it. If you want to know what happened when she got her answer, stay right here. Because what followed will change the way you look at every quiet, unremarkable man you have ever passed without a second glance. Conrad Briggs was up before 5 that Thursday morning. He always was. The shop behind the house was small, a converted single-car garage, and it smelled the way his father's shop had smelled, brass shavings and clock oil, and the faint mineral scent of old steel. The workbench along the back wall was his grandfather's solid maple, worn smooth in the places where a man's forearms rest when he leans in close to work that requires him to breathe slowly and hold very still. On the pegboard above it, every tool had a hook, every hook had a tool. This had been true for 40 years. June appeared in the doorway at 6:15 in her pajamas, the ones with the small foxes on them that she had chosen herself at the store the previous spring, and that were now slightly too short in the leg. She was carrying her stuffed bear under one arm and a piece of toast in her free hand, and she looked at her father the way children look at a parent who they have found doing something they recognize as belonging to that parent specifically, with a kind of settled comfort. Conrad was sitting at the bench under the work light, not working, just looking at the clock. He had set it on the section of bench he kept clear for exactly that purpose, the examination section, the place where things went when they first came in and needed to be considered before they were touched. The clock was approximately 30 inches tall, rosewood case, heavily carved with a painted enamel dial that had gone slightly amber with age. The case was missing 2 of its finials and had a hairline crack along the left side panel that had been repaired badly at some point in the previous century with a substance that was almost certainly hardware store epoxy. The clock itself, however, the movement inside it was something else entirely. June asked if they were going somewhere today. Conrad said they were going to the city. She asked which city. He told her, and she pressed her toast to her chest and said that the city had a fountain, and that the last time they had gone there, she had put her hand in the fountain and a pigeon had looked at her. Conrad said he remembered the pigeon. She came and stood next to the bench and looked at the clock. She asked what it was. He said it was something someone had made a very long time ago. He said it was something someone had made very carefully, and that the people who had it now did not know exactly what they had. June looked at the clock for a moment with the evaluative attention of a child who is accustomed to standing next to her father while he thinks about things. Then she asked if they were going to tell them. Conrad said they were going to try. He had been asked to bring it in by the Wentworth family, or more specifically by the youngest Wentworth, a woman in her 60s named Eugenia who had found it in the attic of the house she had inherited from her aunt, and who had contacted Conrad through the kind of slow word of mouth that still operates in small towns, one person telling another who tells a third. She had described it over the phone as an old clock that probably needed cleaning. Conrad had asked her to send photographs. When they came through, he had sat with his phone for a long time without moving. He had made an appointment at Callaway and Stern because they were the best. Not the friendliest, not the most approachable, but the best, and what was inside that rosewood case deserved the best, even if the outside of it did not announce that fact. He loaded the clock into the back of his truck, wrapped in the canvas he used for furniture moving. With June in the passenger seat holding her fox pajama bear, and the picture book she had been carrying everywhere since her grandmother had given it to her, a thick illustrated history of mechanical clocks and watches that had been written for adults, and that June read with the focused determination of a child who has decided to understand something completely before the week is out. They drove for an hour and 40 minutes. June read aloud periodically, selecting passages that interested her and delivering them in the tone of someone presenting important findings to a colleague. She read a paragraph about the escapement mechanism. She read a paragraph about the relationship between pendulum length and oscillation rate. She asked Conrad if their clock had a pendulum. He said yes. She asked if it was a good pendulum. He said it was a remarkable pendulum. She considered this and went back to her book. Callaway and Stern occupied the ground floor and mezzanine of a building on a commercial block that had been there since before either of them was born, and it had the particular atmosphere of a place that is very certain of its own importance and has arranged its lighting accordingly. The cases along the walls held timepieces that ranged from quietly significant to genuinely extraordinary. The carpet was dark green. The air smelled faintly of something that had been sprayed to smell like nothing in particular. 2 people on the staff wore the sort of jackets that are purchased specifically to be worn in rooms like this one. Brent was one of them. He was standing near the front case when Conrad came through the door carrying the wrapped clock, June at his side. The assessment happened in approximately 4 seconds. Brent had been working in this environment long enough that the assessment had become automatic, involuntary almost, a reflex dressed up as discernment. He turned to his colleague Allison and said what he said. Allison looked at the canvas and the boots and produced the expected small laugh. It was the kind of exchange that people have when they have forgotten they are not alone, or when they have decided that the person within earshot does not count. June looked up at her father. Conrad looked down at her for a moment. He kept his face settled. He said it was all right, that they had an appointment and that they were going to be just fine. He approached the front desk and gave his name and said he had spoken with someone earlier in the week about bringing in a piece for appraisal. The woman at the desk, whose name was Claudia, and who had not participated in the exchange near the front case, found his name in the system and asked him to follow her to one of the appraisal rooms at the back. She offered June a glass of water. June said yes please with great formality and followed Claudia with the gravity of someone attending an important meeting. The appraisal room was small and well lit, a table with a padded surface, 2 chairs across from each other, a magnifying lamp on a swing arm, a set of white cotton gloves folded beside it. Conrad set the clock on the table and began unwrapping the canvas with the unhurried care of a man who has spent his life moving things that cannot be replaced. The junior appraiser who came in first was a man in his early 30s named Tucker, and he was perfectly competent, which was evident from the way he moved and from the questions he asked. He put on his gloves and opened the access panel on the back of the movement and looked at it with the professional thoroughness of someone who knew what to look for. He looked for a long time. Then he excused himself and left the room. June was sitting in the second chair with her bear in her lap and her book open to a page about the Swiss lever escapement. She looked up when Tucker left. She looked at her father. Conrad was looking at the clock. His expression was the one he wore when he was waiting for someone to catch up to what he already knew. Tucker returned with the senior appraiser. Her name was Dr. Lorraine Beckwith, and she had been working in the field for 31 years. She had written 2 books on the subject. One of them was on the shelf in Conrad's shop at home, the spine cracked from repeated use. She came into the room without the look of someone doing a favor. She came in the way she came into any room, precisely without excess motion, her attention already ahead of her. She looked at the clock on the table, she looked at the open access panel and the movement exposed within it. She took the magnifying lamp and adjusted it. She leaned in. She stayed there for a long time. In the room, the only sounds were the ambient noise of the shop beyond the door, the faint tick of 3 other timepieces on the shelves, and the soft, periodic turning of a page as June worked her way through the lever escapement section. Dr. Beckwith straightened up slowly. She did not say anything right away. She looked at the clock from a distance for a moment, then back at the movement. Then she said what she said. She said it was not possible. Claudia, who was still in the room taking notes, looked up. Dr. Beckwith said it more quietly the second time, not to anyone in particular, in the way a person speaks when they are thinking out loud and have not yet remembered where they are. She said it was absolutely not possible. Then she remembered where she was. She turned to Conrad and looked at him clearly for the first time since entering the room, The way people look at someone when they have finally understood that the context has changed entirely. She asked who had brought this in. Conrad said he had. She asked whose clock it was. He explained the Wentworth family, the attic, the phone call, Eugenia's description of a piece that probably needed cleaning. He said it with the slight understatement of a man who had spent a long time in the company of people who said very little when they knew a great deal. Dr. Beckwith looked at him. Then she asked the question she had been moving towards since she entered the room. She asked who had restored the movement. What Brent could not have known, standing in the front room of Calloway and Stern in his good jacket with his careful assessment and his small reflex cruelty, was what Conrad Briggs had been before he became a man who drove a pickup truck from a small town in western Pennsylvania with his daughter, and a wrapped clock and dried mud on one boot. What was not written on his jacket or his canvas cloth or the unhurried way he moved was that Conrad had spent the first 12 years of his working life as the chief restoration specialist at Aldermere House, a private conservancy outside Philadelphia that maintained one of the 4 largest collections of pre-industrial European horology in the world. Not a museum with a gift shop and an audio tour. A conservancy in the original sense. A place where things were kept alive rather than merely preserved. Where the distinction between a running movement and a dead one was treated as the difference between a living thing and a facsimile of it. Conrad had gone there at 24 with a degree he had worked 2 jobs to pay for, and a set of hand tools that had belonged to his father, and before that to his grandfather, a man named August Briggs, who had come from Saxony in 1931 with a suitcase and a specific, inherited understanding of German clockmaking that he had passed to Conrad's father, and Conrad's father had passed to Conrad in the same way knowledge passes through families that take a thing seriously, slowly, through proximity, through watching, through doing. At Aldermere, Conrad had done work that most people in the field had stopped believing was possible. He had restored a documented 1763 bracket clock by Thomas Mudge, one of only 9 surviving examples with the original lever escapement intact, a mechanism so delicate and so precisely calibrated that 3 previous specialists had declined the project on the grounds that attempting it would guarantee destroying it. Conrad had completed the restoration in 14 months. The clock had been running without adjustment for 11 years afterward, which was not supposed to be achievable, and which the senior curator of the conservancy had described in writing as the most significant single act of horological restoration she had witnessed in a 25-year career. He had been approached twice by institutions in London, once by a private collector in Geneva whose name was mentioned in the horological community the way certain names are mentioned, briefly and with care. He had declined both times, not from lack of interest but from a particular understanding of what his work was for, which was not for the market and not for his reputation and not for the kind of story that gets told in the right rooms at the right conferences. It was for the things themselves, for the movements, the escapements, the wheels and pinions, machined by hands that had been dead for 2 centuries and that had nonetheless made something precise enough that it would still be telling time when everyone in the room was gone. He had left Aldermere not because his work was done or because his reputation had run its course, but because his wife was in the hospital in Pittsburgh and then she was not in the hospital anymore. She was in a room at home with a hospital bed in it and a window that looked into the backyard, and Conrad had come back to be in that room with her for as long as there was time in the room to be in. He had read to her in the evenings. He had learned to cook the 3 specific things she wanted when she was hungry and the nausea was low enough to eat. He had sat next to her bed on a folding chair for 11 months and done whatever the specific hour required, and it had not been enough to keep her, which was the thing that Conrad had understood intellectually before it happened and had not understood at all until afterward. June had been 2 years old. She did not remember her mother as a continuous presence, only in the scattered, specific way that very young children form memories, a smell, a sound, a particular quality of light on a particular afternoon. Conrad had done what he could to give her the shape of the person she had lost. He kept photographs at eye level for a child, not up on shelves where they become decorative rather than real. He talked about Claire in the ordinary tense, the way he talked about people who were present in a life rather than people who had been removed from it. The shop at the back of the house had been Claire's idea. She had said he needed somewhere to work, somewhere that smelled right, somewhere that was his in the specific way that a workspace is a person's when it has been organized around the way that person thinks. She had said this 9 months before she died, in a period when she was still making practical plans, still thinking forward, still doing the thing that Conrad had found almost unbearable in its generosity, which was arranging things for a future she would not be in. He had built the bench himself. He had installed the light himself. He had hung the tools on the pegboard in the order that made sense to him, which was not alphabetical or categorical but sequential. In the way his own hands moved through a restoration, the tools he reached for first hung closest, the tools he reached for when the work was nearly done hung at the far right. He took in local work, estate clocks, anniversary clocks, mantelpieces that had stopped running, and that the families who owned them could not bring themselves to throw away. He was methodical and he was thorough and he charged fairly and he did not advertise. People found him the way people in small towns find things, through the slow passage of a name from one person to another, accumulating trust like sediment. It was enough. He had made it be enough, in the deliberate way that a person makes a thing be enough when the alternative requires more of them than they currently have to give. Dr. Beckwith asked him to sit down. Conrad sat. June looked up from her book and then went back to it. Dr. Beckwith said that the movement in the Rosewood case was, to her assessment, the work of a maker she had been trying to document for 11 years. A craftsman who had worked in the German-American tradition in western Pennsylvania in the period between 1880 and 1910, whose pieces kept appearing in private collections and estate sales with no provenance documentation, no maker's mark in any standard registry, and a level of technical execution that she had described in one of her books as anomalous, which in academic language was the word for something that should not exist but demonstrably does. She said the movement in the Rosewood case was the finest example she had ever seen of that maker's work. She said the restoration was invisible. Completely invisible. Not invisible in the way that competent restoration is invisible, where you know where to look and you find the seams. Invisible in the way that was only achieved when the person doing the restoration understood the original work at the level of intention, not just execution. She said she had examined 12 pieces attributed to this maker over the course of 11 years and had been able to identify the restoration work in every single one of them, because restoration always leaves a trace, always, no matter how skilled the restorer, except in this case. She said she had one question. Conrad said she could ask it. She said she wanted to know what facility he had used, what conservancy, what institution, what specialist had done this work, because she wanted to contact them, because work of its quality needed to be documented. Conrad said that the work had been done in his garage in Clearfield County. There was a pause in the room that had a specific texture to it, the texture of a person revising a large number of assumptions simultaneously. Dr. Beckwith said slowly that she wanted to make sure she understood him correctly. He said she did. She looked at his hands. She looked at him the way she had looked at the clock, with the attention of someone whose professional instrument is the precision of their own perception. She asked if he had trained under someone. He said he had trained under his father and his father under his father, and that the oldest of those men had come from Saxony and had brought with him a set of tools and a way of working that Conrad had inherited and had spent 30 years trying to be worthy of. Dr. Beckwith was quiet for a moment. Then she said his name, the full name, not as a greeting but as a kind of recognition, the way you say a thing when you are placing it correctly for the first time. She said, "You're the one who did the Aldermere Mudge." It was not entirely a question. June had stopped turning pages. She was looking at the woman across the table with the focused curiosity she brought to things that she understood to be important without fully understanding why they were important. Conrad confirmed what Dr. Beckwith had said. June looked at her father for a moment, then looked back at her book, apparently satisfied, and turned the page. From beyond the appraisal room door came a sound, Brent setting something down in the outer room, the small sound a person makes when they are trying not to be noticed making sounds, the involuntary noise of someone who has been listening through a door and is hoping not to be identified as having done so. Dr. Beckwith did not look toward the door. She kept her eyes on Conrad. She said she had been the director of acquisitions for the Aldermere Conservancy for 3 years before moving to private consulting, and that she had a particular project she had been unable to staff for 14 months, and that she had not expected to find the person she needed in this room today. She described the project plainly, the way she described everything. A private foundation in Connecticut had acquired, over the course of 8 years, a collection of 17 pre-industrial timepieces with incomplete provenance and significant deterioration. Not all of them were restorable. She believed 11 were. The work would take 2 to 3 years. It would require someone who could work with German, French, and early American movements across 3 different horological traditions. Someone who understood the difference between restoration and reconstruction and who would never confuse the two. Someone whose name would go on every piece of documentation produced in connection with the work, because documentation was the part that lasted when the work itself had gone back into a case and into a room and into the long unobserved life of a well-kept collection. She named the terms. She named the working conditions. She said the foundation had a property in Connecticut with a dedicated workshop that could be equipped to his specifications. She said there was a house adjacent to the property that came with the appointment, a real house, a 2-bedroom with a yard with a school 12 minutes away, that had a program for children with particular aptitudes in mathematics and scientific thinking. She added this last detail without excess emphasis, which made it land more precisely than if she had underlined it. Conrad was quiet. He looked at the clock on the table between them, the rosewood case with the cracked panel and the missing finials and the invisible restoration inside it. He looked at it the way he looked at work when he was trying to see it with fresh eyes rather than his own. June had set her book down. She was watching. Conrad asked if he could have some time. Dr. Beckwith said of course. She took a card from the inside pocket of her jacket and placed it on the padded table surface. Ivory cardstock, her name, a phone number, an email address. She said there was no pressure and no timeline within reason. She said she had been looking for the right person for long enough that a week or two in either direction made no difference to her. She stood. She paused, and then, with the manner of someone finishing a thought they had been holding for a few minutes, she said that she had spent 31 years in this field, and that she could identify the work of perhaps 40 living craftsmen by sight. She said that the ability to enter a movement that someone else had made 130 years ago and to understand it well enough to touch it without leaving a trace behind was not a skill that appeared in people regularly. She said she had encountered it in that form exactly twice in 31 years. She named the first person, then she looked at Conrad and said he was the second. She left. Claudia followed her out and closed the door. June sat in the chair across from her father. The fox pajama bear was in her lap. The book was closed on the table. She looked at him with the particular calm that she had possessed since she was very small, a quality that had come from somewhere Conrad could not entirely account for, since it was not from him, and since the person it had most likely come from had not been there long enough to give it to her directly. She asked her father what the woman had said. Conrad said the woman had asked if he wanted to come and work somewhere for a while. June asked if it was far away. He said it was in Connecticut. She considered this. She asked if Connecticut had a fountain. He said he honestly did not know, but that he thought it probably did. She looked at the clock, then she looked back at him. She said that the woman seemed very serious. Conrad said she was a very serious person. June said that serious people usually knew what they were talking about. He looked at his daughter for a moment. She was 6 years old, and she had her mother's eyes and a great deal of her mother's particular quality, that thing Conrad had never found a word for, the quality of being entirely present in a conversation without needing anything from it beyond the conversation itself. Claire had had it. June had it. Conrad had spent his whole life understanding things with his hands and had never quite managed to cultivate it in himself, and he had noticed in the way that a person notices things they have been noticing for a long time without naming them, that what he had built in the shop for the past 4 years, the careful local work, the methodical days, the life arranged to be survivable, had been missing that quality, had been missing the aliveness that Claire had asked him in one of the last conversations they had when she was still well enough to have the kind of conversation that is about something real, not to abandon. She had said it simply. She had said that grief was not a reason to stop being the person she had fallen in love with. She had said that the version of him that showed up in the shop and gave everything to the work, that person was who she needed June to know, not the diminished version, not the version that had made itself smaller so that loss could not reach it again. He had said he understood. He had meant it, and he had not fully done it, and he had known, in the particular way you know things about yourself that you would rather not know, that he had not fully done it. Brent was in the outer room when they came out. He was doing something with paperwork at the edge of the front desk, an activity that had clearly been selected for its proximity to the appraisal room door rather than its urgency. He looked up when Conrad came through. He had the expression of a man who has recently encountered information that has changed the meaning of something he did earlier and who has not yet settled on what to do with that information. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said that he hoped the appointment had been useful. Conrad looked at him evenly. He said it had been. There was a pause between them that was neither long nor short but was honest in the specific way that pauses are honest when neither person in them is pretending. Brent said he owed him an apology. He said it directly, without dressing it in qualifications or distributing the blame across circumstances. He said the comment he had made when Conrad came in was not something he was proud of. He said he was sorry, to Conrad and to the girl. Conrad looked at him for a moment. June was looking at Brent with the evaluative attention she had been applying to things all morning. Conrad said he appreciated it. Then he picked up the wrapped clock from the counter where Claudia had set it and took June's hand, and they went out through the front door and into the afternoon. The drive home took the same hour and 40 minutes it had taken coming in. June fell asleep somewhere after the first hour, which was the particular sudden sleep of a child who has been attentive and is now releasing all of it at once. Her head tipped sideways against the window. The fox bear was in her lap. The picture book was face down on the seat beside her, held open at the page she had been reading by the natural weight of itself. Conrad drove with his left wrist on the wheel and the radio off, the way he drove when he wanted to think. He thought about the shop behind the house in Clearfield County. He thought about the bench his grandfather had built, and the tools on the pegboard, and the smell that he had spent 30 years learning to think of as the smell of purpose. He thought about the Thomas Mudge bracket clock running in its case at the Aldermere Conservancy, which he had last seen 7 years ago, and which would still be running, which would run for longer than anyone who had been in that room when he finished it would be alive to know about. He thought about Claire on the last really good evening they had had, a night in October when the pain had been low, and she had been well enough to sit outside, and they had sat on the porch together in the dark, and she had told him, in the way she said true things without a great deal of ceremony, that the work was not separate from her, that the care he brought to the things in his shop was the same care he brought to everything and everyone, that she did not want that care to be retired when she was. She said it, and then they sat in the dark for a while longer, and he did not say anything because he did not trust himself to say anything that would be equal to what she had said. He had thought about that evening many times since. It lived in him the way certain evenings do, with a clarity that seemed to increase rather than decrease with distance. He thought about Connecticut. June stirred as they turned onto the county road that led home, opening her eyes to the familiar quality of the light through those particular trees on that particular stretch of road, the unconscious navigation of a child who knows home from a long way off. She looked at her father. She asked if he had decided anything. He said he was still thinking. She said that was okay. She said he could tell her when he was ready. She pressed her face back into the crook of her arm against the window and was asleep again before the next curve. He pulled into the driveway at 6 in the evening. The light was going gray and soft. He lifted June out of the passenger seat without waking her, her weight familiar and particular in his arms, the way a person's specific weight is familiar when you have been lifting them since they were small enough to carry in one arm. He carried her inside and put her in her bed without fully waking her, pulled the blanket up, left the nightlight on the way she preferred it, its small warm circle on the wall above her dresser. He went back out to the garage. He did not turn on the work light right away. He stood in the dark with his hand resting on the bench and let his eyes adjust. Through the small window that connected the garage to the house he could see the light from June's room, and if the night was quiet enough, which it was, he could hear, or thought he could hear, the sound of his daughter breathing in sleep, though it was possible that was only the particular quality of the silence that exists in a house where someone you love is resting. Dr. Beckwith's card was in his jacket pocket. He took it out and set it on the bench between a pair of mainspring pliers and a tin of clock oil and looked at it. The card had her name and a phone number and an email address. That was all. No institutional affiliation, no title, just her name, which told him something about the kind of person she was, and which was consistent with everything else he had observed about her in an hour and a half of conversation. He turned the work light on. The shop came into its familiar resolution around him. He stood at the bench and looked at the tools on the pegboard, and at the space where the Wentworth clock would go when he brought it back from the city, and he thought about the movement inside it and the hands that had made it that he would never know the names of, and he thought about the particular quiet satisfaction of understanding a thing well enough to touch it without leaving a mark. He stood there for a long time, not deciding, not quite, or deciding slowly the way he did most things from the inside out without announcing the process to anyone including himself. Sunday morning June found him in the garage before 7. She climbed onto the stool beside the bench without asking, which she always did, which left barely enough room for both of them and which neither of them addressed. She was wearing her robe over her pajamas, and her hair was doing the overnight chaos that Conrad had learned to find endearing rather than chaotic, and she was carrying her bear and the clock book, which she had apparently retrieved from the truck at some point the previous evening. She settled onto her half of the stool and opened the book and looked at the page she had marked. She did not ask him anything. After a while she said, not looking up from the book, that she had looked up Connecticut. He asked where. She said on the big atlas on the shelf in the hallway. She said Connecticut was not very far. She said it was next to other places. She said it was by her measurement with her hand across the page, probably about the same distance as going to her grandmother's house, except in a different direction. Conrad looked at his daughter. She said she was just saying. He reached over and smoothed down the section of her hair that was most aggressively vertical. She submitted to this with the air of someone accepting an editorial note they find reasonable. He picked up Dr. Beckwith's card from the bench. He looked at it in the morning light that was coming through the high window, gray and clean and without ambition. He turned it over. The back was blank. He put it in the front pocket of his shirt. He stood up and said they were going to get breakfast and that he had some things to tell her on the way back. June put her book under her arm, took her father's hand, and pulled him toward the door with the focused energy of a child who has been patient for long enough and is now prepared to move. They went out through the side door. The garage door rolled down behind them. Inside, on the bench in the early light, the tools hung in their order on the pegboard, every hook occupied, every implement in its proper place, patient in the way of things that are accustomed to waiting for the hands that know how to use them.